Okay, everyone, welcome back. This is going to be the final lecture for Unit 2. This will be Chapter 16, Mass Media and Policymaking by Stuart Soroka, Stephen Farnsworth, Andrea Lawler, and Lori Young. And we're mostly just going to focus on media and its impact on agenda setting especially, but also on sort of the broader policymaking stuff, right? Okay. And I'm going to skip over the case study at the end. We're just going to focus on the theory. All right, section 1. They basically just want to say, like, the common conception is that media only really matters in framing and agenda setting, but media has a role to play in basically all 5 steps, right? So it's a little short-sighted to think of media as only agenda setting or sort of framing framework. Okay. Section 16.2, agenda setting and issue attentiveness. All right, so we know that citizens and policymakers sort of rely on media cues to prioritize particular pieces of information and to disseminate public opinion, right? Policymakers are also newsmakers, however, and this is something I would add to the chapter, in that they're always on the news, right? They're doing interviews. They're out, on C-SPAN. They're, all over the place on podcasts, and so in a sense, yes, media is influencing policymakers, but also vice versa, right? Policymakers are heavily influencing media. Media have a very bad tendency to focus on sensationalism, right? And this is where like long form media can be excellent, right? And long form media is what I will always push you toward. My favorites are foreign affairs. It's a very balanced long form media piece from experts from both sides get to sort of say their piece, right? And you as the reader get to decide who is right or wrong or what pieces you accept, right? They try very hard not to have just one focus. I would also point out, like The Economist. It's a weekly. It is incredibly in depth. They have entire floors of their building dedicated to fact checking and data production and data analysis. Um, and it's pretty centrist, right? I would say like they take a slightly leftist perspective on social issues like I don't know, abortion or civil rights or things like that. They take a slightly rightist perspective on economics, but a very, very well thought, well constructed piece of long form media that has existed longer than the United States of America, right? Like they have institutional stability, right? And their need to continue that makes them very careful about the information that they put out, right? Now, I would also say no media is perfect, right? But there is certainly a spectrum. The people who just claim that like all media is bullshit are full of it, right? It's a spectrum, right? From the most garbage, talking head, podcast conspiracy guys to super high level Economist, New York Times kind of hard hitting journalism and fact based and data based journalism. There is a vast spectrum here, right? So anyone who's trying to claim that like Alex Jones is on the same level as The Economist is full of shit. Okay. Okay. Next, research tends to find that the more complex an issue is, the more intricate it is, the more technical it is, the less power that the media has to influence the framing or the narrative. And I would add here that this is a problem of consumption too, right? The more highly technical, research based, database stuff, not only does it make it harder to influence the framework because it's so contextual and difficult to try to parse out. But also, most people just don't have the education or the understanding or the background to be able to dig into that stuff. And so they are drawn to the more sensationalist, talking head garbage that's out there, right? And we're seeing a rise in this kind of stuff. So not only does the complexity sort of reduce the influence, but it also turns off large portions of the population who just don't have the capability or the training to sort of digest what they're reading, right? So this is difficult. Okay. Section 16.3, issue framing. So first we're going to define framing. This is the selection of and the emphasis upon particular attributes for the agenda when talking about some subject or object or policy or whatever it might be, right? And so this inherently means that there's information that is included and there's information that's not included. And I would suggest to metacognate about the things that you're reading and how willing are they to present both sides sometimes or to offer deeper analysis, these sorts of things, right? Um, yeah. So to frame a story is inevitably to withhold something, right? Or prioritize something. We've talked about this. Models cannot be the world, right? Um, to simplify, we need to create some sense of a model. And so this means that something generally gets left out, right? And so this is the difficulty of science is trying to have an inclusive and thoughtful model of the way things work. But some journalism doesn't necessarily take that approach. All right. A really famous piece of research from Iyengar, who is a very, very famous political scientist and sort of sociologist, suggests that there's really two types of frames in the media landscape, right? You have a thematic frame. And they say this gives information about general trends, such as like poverty or social welfare or whatever it might be. And it tends to promote a sense of social or institutional responsibility. And on the other end, we have what are called sort of episodic frames that are based on individuals or personal experience. And these tend to place responsibility on the individual themselves, right? And so things like poverty, right, can take very different approaches. Some media outlets are going to say, look, this is a social structure problem. This is a problem with the elites soaking up all the money in our economy, or this is a problem of we're not doling out enough social goods for education or social welfare or whatever it might be. And then on the other side, sometimes you have a more episodic approach, like, okay, you're just lazy, or you refuse to go get a job, or you didn't educate yourself, or whatever it might be, right? And so there are very different sort of structural frameworks from which we can approach things. Okay. Section 16.4, media as policy actor and their challenges, right? So there are a number of problems with this sort of media as policy actor approach, right? And I would say, like, media is all but inevitable. I mean, we have the First Amendment. The population needs to know what's going on in their government, what's going on in their society. Just cutting off all media is dictatorial, like China or Russia or whatever, right? So, like, media is all but inevitable, especially in a democracy. But there are issues, right? The first is that many of the sort of research realm are very critical of the media's ability to contribute to an informed public debate, right? And they say, especially with TV news, and I would add, because this is a little outdated, about a decade old, the talking head stuff, right? Podcasts and the Joe Rogans of the world and the Alex Joneses and these sorts of stuff, right? They purport to be media and news and to contribute to informed public debate, but much of it is conspiracy, just like completely distorted. Um, and there's always this, oh, I'm just asking questions. What's wrong with that? Well, when it's fascist or racist or sexist, like, yeah, there is something wrong with that, right? Like you're trying to pretend like you're not pushing racist, fascist, sexist shit um, by just asking questions, right? But in a sense, like your asking of these questions is normalizing these sexist, racist, fascist thoughts, right? Um, and you know, I shouldn't just pick on the Joe Rogans and Alex Joneses of the world. You know, TV media is pretty bad about this too, right? Like Fox News or MSNBC or whatever it might be. Always be skeptical of a talking head, right? And so they have five major critiques under this sort of realm. First, TV news and news in general, especially non long form news, tends to focus on a lot of trivial shit, right? And that doesn't necessarily add anything to the public discourse. The second is that these media members have very close ties to official sources, and often we find that they protect those official sources and don't hold them to account because they want to keep those sources, right? And that can be a very problematic relationship. The third is, like we've discussed, a lack of full context, right? Sort of, I don't know, you're either decontextualizing the situation or you're flat out propagandizing. These can be problems, right? Another problem can be ideological bias. We know that every human on earth has some biases, right? And journalists are no different. And the journalism industry sometimes is no different, right? There are biases. Um, and so this is, in many senses, why you need a fact checking organization, an editorial board, all of these sorts of things. And then finally, they say a lack of expertise for issues they cover. And I would add that this is a problem too with our policymakers, not just the media. Yeah, like why are people who have a sort of degree in journalism trying to teach us about the science of climate change or I don't know, social welfare systems or whatever it might be, right? And this is also a problem with policymakers. Our legislatures are stuffed with lawyers who have simply been taught to debate all the time, right? But that's not expertise. Um, I mean, yes, it's expertise in the legal realm, but it's not necessarily expertise in the infrastructure realm or healthcare technology or uh, environmental stuff or you know the poisons in our rivers and lakes. I mean, all of these sorts of things, right? So this this idea that like it's very difficult sometimes uh, in that our media members and our policymakers don't necessarily have any expertise in the subjects on which they are discussing or trying to create policy or trying to disseminate information, right? Their second major critique is that some researchers are concerned with sort of journalistic norms themselves and how they can tend to lead to misleading coverage, right? And they really point to this both sidesism, right? And this is a big debate in the United States right now. The fair, uh, what is it called? The Fair Coverage Act or something like that, where you're supposed to give time to both sides. But sometimes both sides don't deserve time, right? When we think about something like climate change, the absolute vast majority of science concerning climate change suggests that this is human created. It it does exist, right? Um, but the journalism realm and media realm tend to give way more credence to the skeptics than they probably should, right? Which has led to some weird issues in the United States concerning sort of energy consumption, renewable resources, investments in renewables, all of these sorts of things, right? And so this can be a big difficulty. And we saw, God, 30 to 40 years of piss poor coverage about climate change. And then in the last decade or so, it's come out from internal documents from places like BP and Exxon that they knew the entire time for 50 years that this was happening and that climate change was real and that they were destroying the world environment. Um, and yet they've been given the benefit of the doubt. Um, and that can be troubling, right? Um, the media tends to focus on conflict rather than science or fact, right? Uh, because it needs to be juicy and they want eyeballs on it or whatever. But that, in many ways, sort of again can normalize or give far more power to ideas that have been disproven or are very weak empirically, or all of these sorts of things, right? And I would also say, again, this is not only media, but also our policymakers. There is a huge misunderstanding of how science works, what scientific evidence is, what scientific processes look like, and even the idea that, like, well, there's a correlation there, it must be a cause. That's not science, right? Um, there is a correlation between uh, the sales of ice cream and violent crime, right? But that's not the cause. The cause is increasing heat, right? So as a city becomes hotter and hotter, uh, people start to commit more crimes, especially violent crimes, right? And so this is a very well known example of this correlation is not causation problem, right? The heat is causing greater ice cream sales and greater violent actions. But ice cream sales, while it's correlated with violent actions, is not the cause, right? And so this is a very problematic situation with policymakers and with media presentation. Um, and then their final critique really is that media has a very, very short term focus, right? What's popping off right this second? Once, you know, once the newest thing pops up, we're on to the next thing, right? And so we don't get a long term contextual understanding of things, which again is why I would point you to long form journalism, right? All right, that's all I got here. Thank you so much for being here for Unit 2. I will get up the grades as soon as I can moving forward. Um, I've got a lot of you this time compared to usual. So please give me a little patience and I'll get it done as soon as I can. Thank you so much.